Torah and Creation, Part 3. For all those that are joining in now, in the first two classes, we have covered yet basically day one. It was a slow beginning, a lot of basic introductions and parts that are involved in the beginning of creation. And tonight we're going to hopefully start to move a little bit faster. There's only 2 parts left of the series. So tonight we're going to hopefully do day 2 through 5. People get a lot in. And then the next class we'll discuss at the end exactly when it's going to be. A week from tonight is going to be still Rosh Hashanah, so that will not be a good night for a class. So we'll discuss it afterwards. Right now we're up to day 2. So can we get a volunteer to read day 2? We're on page 5 in this, which is the second page in the pamphlet. There's shoulder notes, so it says second day next to it, so it shouldn't be hard to find.
Is that firmament? How do you say that?
Firmament.
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 What
Okay,
it means
I'll
is
read it.
harder to understand in the English than the Hebrew.
Okay. What does it mean?
That's a good question. Anyone have
The
a...
ground.
Is that literally what it means? I don't even know what it literally means.
Okay. I want me to read it?
Please, I love
Okay.
that.
God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate between water and water."
Yeah, continue to understand that.
So God made the firmament and separated between the waters which were beneath the firmament and the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. God called to the firmament heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day.
Awesome. Guys, give it up for Joey.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay, so day 2, again, day 1 we spoke about last time. Again, the first 2 verses were the introduction to God creating the whole world. And then God created light. That was the initial creation of day 1. That's 2 classes in 10 words. Day 2 starts now with water. The entire world, as far as we know, is water. Actually, let's get another volunteer to quickly read the 3rd day also, because we're going to kind of compare and contrast them. So anyone want to read the 3rd day?
God said, "Let the waters beneath the heaven be gathered into one area, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called to the dry land earth, and to the gathering of waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, herbage yielding seed, fruit trees yielding fruit, each after its kind, containing its own seed on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, herbage yielding seed after its kind, and trees yielding fruit, each containing its seed after its kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, there was morning, a 3rd day.
Okay, so these 2 days, as we can see, both discuss the formation of the earth, we would say more, right? Day 2 is a separation of, in the midst of the waters, he made certain waters beneath the firmament, certain waters above the firmament. That was day 2. Day 3 was the gathering of waters to reveal the land. Now there's a nuance that you'll notice in day 2. Here's kind of a picture of the waters, the lower waters and upper waters. In day 2, God separates between the lower waters and the upper waters, right? That's what's happening. The whole entire world is kind of just like this, like jumble, spoke about last time, and from that, God extracted everything out of that. In day 2, God is separating the lower water and the upper water, and you'll notice, if you read through all these verses, if you read through it a few times, you notice, I'll just mention it, to bring it out more obviously. If you look in verse 4, after God creates the light, it says God saw that the light was good. If you look in verse 10, it says God called the dry land earth, the waters he called seas, saw it was good. If you go to verse 18, go to every day. At the end of every day, God creates something. At the end of that, like in the verse 18, for example, he's creating the sun and the moon, days and nights, and it says God saw it was good. And if you keep going through all the days it says, and God saw it was good. Verse 21, by the creations in the seas, every day it mentions God saw it was good. We come to day 2, and as Jory just read, it was good. That's the phrase we find throughout. And on day 2, we find something missing. God separates the waters, and he doesn't mention anything about that being good. He just mentions that these waters are separated, and that's it. So the question is, if you're approaching the Torah with an analytical eye, what's going on here? Every day God creates something, says it was good. All of a sudden, we come here, was it not good that they separated the waters? What's wrong with separating the water? What's the problem here? Why is it not mentioning Vayar Elokim Kitov. Kitov is Hebrew for it was good. Why is there no mention of it was good here? So, what do we do to find the answer? What do we always look? Rashi, right? Exactly. Rashi brings in the oral law, which we explained. The oral law is the explanation of the written law. When something's in the written law, we don't know what it means. So we always look to the oral law, which is just not adding anything, but explaining what the written law means. So we notice there's something missing here. All of a sudden, it doesn't say it was good. So who did their homework? If you remember last time, we left off with homework. You don't have to, we won't call anyone out. We ended off with a question last time. And we mentioned that day one has a unique ending, unlike any other day. The second day, like Jory just read, said there was a second day. Evening, morning, a second day. Mark read the third day, evening, morning, a third day. Etc. Evening, morning, a fourth day, a fifth day. On the first day, what did it say?
It was 1 day.
1 day, right? It didn't say a first day, it said 1 day. So we asked the question last time, why does it say 1 day? Why isn't it consistent with all the other days? All the days are in relative terms. First, second, third, fourth. But for some reason, 1 is not first. 1 is 1 day. That was the question we asked last time. And we didn't have a chance to discuss that now. But it's very interconnected with this question of how come on day 2, there's no mention of it being good. And there's really let's take this in 2 levels. The basic answer is because when was it good? It was good when God completed his action. Every time God completed the creation of light, God said, oh, it was good. He completed the creation of the fish, he said, oh, it was good. He completed the creation of man, and it was good. With water, on the second day, he separated the 2 waters, but he didn't really complete the creation of water until on the third day, he separated the water from the land, and thereby creating land, which is called earth, and the seas. Since the completion didn't happen until the third day, it doesn't say it was good on the second day, because the work wasn't complete yet. You only say it was good once the work was complete. Right? Got that? So the question is, why didn't God complete it on the second day? Everything else he completed. I'll just point one thing out very interesting. If you look at the third day, it actually says it twice. It says in verse 10, he called the dry land earth and the water seas. That was the completion of the creation of water. So it says God saw it was good. And then again in verse 12, after he brought forth vegetation, trees, fruit, God saw that was good. So there was really 2 creations, and when God completed them both, which is also unique, only in the third day, does it mention ki tov, it was good twice. So the question is, what's going on? Why didn't God just finish the creation of water on the second day, keep that good package day to itself, and then go to the third day and keep that day to itself? Why is he stopping in the middle, so to speak? And so this answer is a Kabbalistic idea that I think answers it best. And tell me if you agree or not. And the other answers are always welcome. And the concept is like this, and we mentioned this a little bit, touched on a little yesterday, but the concept is that on day 1 there was a complete unity of everything that existed in the world. There weren't parts. Once you have a concept, try to think abstractly for a second, once you have a concept of day 2, by definition, day 2 is not day 1, right? Because it's day 2. So inherently, whatever is now day 2 is inherently distinct and separate. Just merely the fact that it's a second day creates a distinction of it from day 1. That's already 2 parts here. Now, the fact that on day 1, why does it call it day 1, not a first day? So Rashi explains that day 1 was a day when God was the only one around, the only being, the only creation, and he was alone in his world. Just him in this like hodgepodge of unity of tohu and bohu, like we said, or this like this nothingness and everythingness all at the same time. Potential for everything within nothingness. Black hole of potential. So once there was that 1 day of complete unity, that breaking apart into 2 parts is an extremely bad thing in Judaism. When you look throughout Judaism, the number 2 is a generally hated number in Judaism. Most good things aren't 2 in Judaism. Judaism generally likes 1. 1 is always representative of God, united, unity, oneness. 2 is often symbolic of separation, because it's that 1 breaking down into parts. When things break down into parts, that implies disunity. The Midrash actually teaches us that on day 2, in addition, we mentioned in the past that It doesn't list every single thing that was created in the Torah. Whenever God decided he needed to mention us, he does, but there's a lot of other stuff in the world the Torah doesn't mention. So day 2, God created on day 2 the angel of death, which is the Jewish version of Satan, created hell, and he created the concept of machlokas, the concept of dispute. So why did he create this on day 2? So they explain, Kabbalah explains that it's inherent to day 2. The fact that day 2 existed is a bad thing, because that means that there was this unity, this perfection, and when it breaks down into parts, now it becomes multiple parts, it automatically lacks in it. Imagine you have no one likes that first person to cut the cake, right? Because it's beautiful cake, it's one right now, it's perfection, and once you put the knife through it, even if you didn't take a piece out yet, you just put the knife through it, it's already like broken up. It's like not the same anymore. That's why, if you want someone to take, just put the knife in, cut it down, and even though you didn't take the piece of it, people will start taking, because it's already ruined that perfection, that unity of what the cake once was. So day 2, God couldn't write what was good on day 2, because the inherent reality of day 2 was a negative concept. The way we fix that in Judaism is number 3. The concept of 3 in Judaism is an extremely positive number. And what the concept does is speak out the timeline here. 1 means unity, godliness, unity connected unto God, that's 1. 2 is a breaking apart of that. And what 3 is it's really like it's like the balancer, basically. Like imagine you have like 2 character traits to talk about this with. You have extreme generosity and extreme stinginess. So each one of them are in conflict with each other until there's like a third character trait that's able to come in and balance these 2 countering parts. It's the same thing they say, the Talmud speaks about marriage is the same thing, right? When you have a husband and wife, so that's 2. So that's bad, so how can we have 2? It should be disunity, they're not the same person, and they have their own needs and their own struggles. So the Talmud says, if you have God in your marriage with you, that's supposed to be that third party that's the stabilizer of the 2 of you, right? Because you have different characters of the man, different characters of the woman, but when you're both kind of focused on being godly, that's a uniter of these things to both use your strengths in a positive way. Just a cool aside, I don't have a picture for this, but they give an example of like a triangle, whatever, imagine a triangle, and one side of the bottom is man, this side is woman, and God's on the top. So the furthest apart man and woman can be is down here on the bottom. As they get closer to God, they become more God-like, they naturally become closer to each other, right? As we develop ourselves to become more godly, more giving, less selfish, becoming greater people, closer to God through that naturally allows us to become closer to our spouses as well. So that's a very important concept. And because of that, on day 3, it actually says it was good twice. Why is that? Because day 3 took this negativity of day 2 and it made it real, so to speak. It brought it to fruition. It wasn't a bad thing anymore. It took the water and it made a separation between water and land. Right? It allowed it to bring out its potential. And the concept is that if you have potential to do something, but you haven't done it yet, right? What's a great person? A great person is someone who has a lot of potential. There's a great person who's done a lot of great things, right? A great person is someone who's done a lot of great things. So the concept of 3 is really taking 2 different character traits, 2 different potentials, and making them great. The concept is, as I said here, potential means nothing if you don't do anything with it. And that's why day 2, the water was there, the water was separated, the water was fully potentially there, but it wasn't good yet. What's good? It was good when it was completed. When you use it properly and it's in its proper form, that's when it really becomes fully maximizing. It becomes a pro. That's the word I'm looking for. So how we have it.
Utilize.
Fulfills its potential.
Fulfills the potential, right? That's what fulfills potential when you really do the full thing with it. Okay, so that's basically just a nice kind of a diak, it's called in Hebrew, an inference from the verse. The verse doesn't mention it was good on the 2nd day. Why not? It teaches us the water wasn't completed. Why wasn't it completed? Because there was an inherent sadness in creation, that this unity that God had always to himself. Once he created the world, that the world, so to speak, exists outside of himself. He distances himself from that world. That allows this world to have fights and anger and disputes and hell and all these bad things come out of the fact that there's a lack of clarity of God in the world. And that's represented by the whole concept of day 2, which is, it was good. Okay, moving on. Now, there's a very interesting idea in the Midrash on this. Again, we spoke out last time that what the Midrash does is the Midrash will kind of give somewhat of like an allegorical explanation of the Torah to bring out a message that the Torah is trying to relay with you, not necessarily through the direct words of the verse, but it comes from there, and you can always see how it comes from there. So the Midrash explains, and we can discuss exactly what it means when it says this. Let's just first say what it says, and then I hope everyone will ask questions and pull me out if it doesn't make sense then. The Midrash explains that there were two waters, right? It started as one big hodgepodge of water, and it says God separated the upper waters and the lower waters, which means there were certain upper waters that remained on top with God, and there were certain lower waters that had to be lowered down to the physical, earthly world. Now imagine you're a water molecule. Everyone got that? And you had two opportunities. You could either stay close to God in that united, holy world, or you can go down to this physical world when you kind of like lose sight of God totally. Where would you rather be? Not all at once. Oh, you'd rather be up, you'd rather be with God. So all the waters that were forced to go down, the Medrash speaks it out in the form as if they were having a conversation with God. And it says that the waters that were forced to go down were upset. Like, why do we have to separate from you, God? There's a lot of water. You're just going to make us go down? Like, that's not fair. We'll discuss it in a second, right? But why should we have distance ourselves from you? We also want to be close to you. You can't just put us apart from our brother water. So what does God do? God tells them, I apologize. Normally I'm much more fluid with when things always come up. I'm not as accustomed with the slides now as I should be. But so here are angry waters, right? They're not happy. God's forcing them to go down. God wants to figure out how to turn them and transform them into happy waters. How can we appease the waters that were forced to go down? So what does God do? God gives them a very interesting thing the Torah says God did. And just let anyone know what this is a picture of. So I got this picture online. The altar did not have steps on it. It says it's supposed to be in the verse. It had a ramp, not steps. So I take no responsibility for where this picture came from. It is supposed to be a picture of the altar. I did not notice that when I was putting it up. It's not an accurate picture, but it is a picture of an altar. And imagine for ourselves the altar of the temple. And the Torah says that God told the water, because of this, that I distanced you from me, I'm going to give you a special appeasement. What's the appeasement? The appeasement is that on every single sacrifice that's going to go on the altar, I'm going to put salt. This would be an obligation. There's an explicit verse in Leviticus that every sacrifice you bring on the altar has to come with salt, which is a little bit weird. Because what does putting salt on the altar have to do with the waters being distanced from God? Right? Mark has an idea?
No, I'm just wondering why you chose more natural salt instead of kosher salt.
So I was debating it. Some say that he had to specifically put on the altar sea salt, so I specifically tried finding sea salt. That was actually a reason for that. But I didn't validate that, so I was like, didn't mention anything, but I still put it there. And that was why. I was debating between sea salt and kosher salt. Good call.
Salt written out in salt.
Exactly. So the question is, why salt? How does that appease the waters? So anyone who's heard it before, some awesome idea.
Salt water?
So there's a lot of salt. The ocean is salt water. Most of the water that came down is salt water. The other Midrash explains that came from this process. They were upset about being left, and they were crying, whatever that means, and became salty all of them. That's some kind of, I'm not going to get into that because I myself don't really know what that means. I try to only discuss things that I understand. So the question is, why this? So anyone know what salt is? What is salt composed of?
Calcium chloride.
Sodium.
Sodium chloride.
There we go. Sodium chloride, right? Na, going back to like 10th grade chemistry, anyone here? Na is sodium, Cl is chloride, sodium chloride. So what salt is actually a compound of sodium and chloride. Now there's something extremely cool about this compound. And that is that independently, if you take sodium alone in and of itself, or if you take chloride alone in and of itself, they're both dangerous to human beings. They're not healthy. You can't digest them. I don't know if it kill you or not, but it's unhealthy for you to digest them. However, when you combine the two of them together, it produces a necessary nutrient. right? We all need salt. When you put these two things that are independently dangerous together, it produces something that we need for ourselves. Now break it down one step deeper, and it's a really cool idea. And the concept is that sodium, pure sodium, comes in powder form. It's a physical mass, right? There's no powder, there's something there. Chloride is not a powder, chloride is actually a gas. So I heard it explained once, an awesome idea, and that is that sodium being the physical mass represents the concept of physicality. Chloride being a gas, which you can't touch, you can't feel gas, it's just a gas. So that represents the concept of spirituality, right? It's a gas, it's floating, it's not tangible. And the concept is, the Jewish model of holiness is really salt. In what way? If you have only each of them alone, if I only have sodium, it's dangerous. What does that represent? Physicality. If I only have physicality, and I isolate my physicality, and that's all I just delve into pure physical, sensual pleasure, so you're lost. You're lost because it's dangerous. It's not a healthy way to be. The same is true with the opposite approach. If you're extremely holy and you distance yourself from everything physical in the world, that is not a Jewish approach to holiness. We're supposed to have a connection to the physical world as well. The Jewish model of holiness is taking these two independent dangers of physicality and spirituality, of sodium and chloride, and putting them together to create a necessary nutrient of life. And that's really represented in salt. That's why you find salt. Like, for example, on your Shabbat table, you're supposed to have salt on the table. Some people dip the challah in salt, even those that don't dip challah in salt, still brought down in halacha, you should have salt on your table. Why? Because since the temple has been destroyed, the equivalent version of the altar, the Talmud says, is actually our table. Our table that we eat on is the equivalent of the altar in the temple, and because of that, there's this covenant of the salt, which exists on our miniature altar also, which again is this concept of Jewish holiness, which is taking this fusion of physicality. We're about to eat a Shabbos meal, right? This is a physical pleasure that we're enjoying right now, but we're using it what? For God. What's the greatest example of this union? A sacrifice. What's a sacrifice? You're taking a cow, you're taking an animal, you're taking a physical being, and you're using this physicality to connect spiritually to God. That fusion of using the physical and the spiritual is what salt is. That is salt. So what was God telling the lower waters? How is this appeasing the lower waters? What did it do for them? So the answer is that what God was telling the lower waters was, you guys are going down. You guys are going to be in the physical world now. But specifically because you're creating this physical world for man, that's going to be able to allow us to have this Jewish holiness. Because you're going to be this physical entity, that's going to allow people to use you to connect back to holiness. And going down to being physical will allow man to use that for holiness, which elevates you even higher than if you were just always holy. Like, what's better? We'll get to this more on the sixth day, but just mention the concept now. Who's a greater being, man or angel? Man. Why?
Free will.
Because we struggle, right? If we struggle with something and you come out ahead, that's much greater than just not struggling, right? So being used, being downtrodden, and being able to pick yourself up out of that, that's a much greater level than just always being on top, right? So that's really the message of the lower waters. God said, lower waters, you're leaving me, you're being distant from me, but specifically through that allows us to lift up physicality and to allow man to really actualize the potential and make themselves great. And that's an awesome thing about the splitting of the waters. I guess just as an aside, I don't know if it bothers anyone or not, when the Medrash talks about things like God talked to the waters and the waters were like upset at him, and does that bother anyone? It doesn't bother me, I don't need to talk about it. If it does, we could talk about it. What?
I like that stuff.
You like it, it makes sense to you. As certain people are more like, it doesn't make any sense, doesn't make sense. Okay, everyone's happy with it, great. Now we can explain it. Perfect. So, moving on. That was really the message of day 2. Again, day 2, the message was that until you perfect yourself, until you bring out your potential, what is good? What is good? Good is bringing yourself to fruition. That is good. And the second message is that the message of Jewish holiness, which is this message of salt, of physicality and spirituality jiving together, which is an amazing thing. Day 3 is really, there's 2 parts to day 3 we mentioned, right? One part of day 3 is really the end of day 2. It's the finishing off of the work of the water. It was good. And then there's a second one which sprout forth vegetation and other stuff. So if we read verse 3, it says a very interesting thing, not verse 3, sorry, day 3. It says, look at verse 10 for a second. I can read it to you. Verse 10 says, God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of waters he called seas. And God saw it was good. So the question is like this. In the Hebrew, it's a little bit more clear in the Hebrew, but I think it's accurate in English also. God called the land earth. That is in the singular, right? God called the land earth in the singular. It sounds like one clod of earth. And then he called the pool of waters. He called the gathering of waters seas. Seas is in the plural. The question is, why is land in the singular and seas in the plural? So does anybody recall this concept? You know what we're looking at here?
Pangea, continental drifts.
There we go, right? Pangea, or continental drift, which means there's a certain theory. This person here, look familiar to anyone? I'd be very impressed if I didn't know who this was. Anyone? Mark, you're our local trivia guy.
Sorry to disappoint.
Okay, his name is Alfred Wegener, and he was a German meteorologist in the early 1900s, late 1800s. I thought you'd know all German meteorologists. He's the one who claimed that he developed the theory in 1915. He put it out to the world of the concept of continental drift, where the world having started as one mass supercontinent and drifting off to 7 continents. There is a fascinating commentary by this person here. I'll be equally impressed if you know who that is. Any takers? I'll give you hints. He was not a German meteorologist.
Rashi.
Good guess? No? This is a picture of Abraham ibn Ezra. He was a great sage. I'm sure.
Yeah.
I don't doubt you for a second. Don't worry. He lived 1089 to 1167, I believe mostly in Spain. He wrote a tremendous commentary on Torah itself, on Chumash, as well as he was a poet and a lot of other amazing works. He writes, and he infers in the word aretz, that the word aretz is written in the singular. Bear in mind, this was written roughly in the early to mid 1100s. That's 800 years before Alfred Wegener existed or lived. He writes there explicitly that the world, when it says aretz in the singular, is referring to one central landmass. And he says, I actually never saw this until a few days ago when I was looking into this. I was curious. I'm like, I wonder what Judaism says about Pangea, because I knew that was a concept. And everything when I looked it up, everyone quoted this source, and he actually writes there in the early 1100s that the world started as one supercontinent, and he says it drifted off from there to 7 different lands. That's what he writes, which is an amazing thing.
What year was this?
He died in 1167, so I don't know what year he wrote it in. He lived from 1080s to 1160s, so I don't know, say 1142, maybe. But yeah, 800 years, 700 years before him, right? So the question, right? How did he know this? How could he possibly know this? They didn't even discover America till 1492, right? So the concept of 7 land masses is a crazy thing to have suggested and known, but that is inferred from our verse, because that God called land earth, which is referring to seemingly one clod of land. One clod of land would imply that there was one creation of land in verse 10. Contrast that to if you look at day 3. So if you look at the world here, so we notice that even nowadays after the drift, all the land, all the waters are really all connected. We don't really have multiple bodies of water that are independent. The continents don't necessarily touch each other. But water, more or less, is a picture of the world, ocean, and seas. And basically everything's connected. You can have the Arabian Sea and the other sea, Angamian Sea. Pick either one. You can have the Barents Sea and the Norwegian Sea and the Greenland Sea. And they're really just 3 different points that's really in the same body of water, which is connected to the Atlantic, which is connected to the Indian and Pacific, and etc. So the question is, if all the waters are really connected, so why would the Torah say and God called them the seas, which implies it's plural, it should say the sea. Because just like if it's one body of land, we call it land in the singular. One body of water, we should call the sea. Right? The great sea. Why are we calling it the seas? So again, we look to Rashi. Rashi says this doesn't make sense. Why would the Torah call it seas? All water is connected. We don't know independent water bodies. They're all connected. So Rashi says an amazing thing. Anyone here likes salmon? I'm not asking Mark. I know he doesn't like it. Anyone else like salmon?
I like it.
There we go. Salmon. Okay, so there's different types of salmon, right? Let's throw out some names of salmon. Norwegian salmon,
Alaskan.
Alaskan salmon,
Coho.
Toho,
Coho.
Coho salmon. Okay, we'll come over to that later. Never had that one before.
Smoked.
The smoked salmon. I like that. From the famous smokelands.
Yes.
Exactly. So the question is, why is it that there's Norwegian salmon and Alaskan salmon and Coho salmon? I assume Coho is never the place.
I have no idea.
I don't know. Maybe it's a style of preparation, or it's is it a style of preparation, or is it like
breed.
it's a breed? Okay. So why is it that Norwegian salmon tastes different than Alaskan salmon? Again, Norwegian seas over here, it's over there. Why does it taste different if it's the same salmon? So Rashi says that it doesn't. The taste of aspamia, which is the fish that they would eat in their day, I'm not sure exactly what it's translated as, it tastes different in different seas. Even though all these seas are connected, we find it tastes different. And that's because each body of water has its own makeup. They have their own things that grow inside of it, and their own life, and their own kind of like, even though they're connected, this sea will look nothing at all like this sea. If you look at the life that lives in it, and the plants and everything else that exists there, it's as if it's two totally separate seas. So Rashi explains that the Torah calls it seas, since each one kind of has its own ecosystem and its own, even for the same product, even for the same fish, it'll just taste different in two different places. That's proof of the fact that in a certain sense, the Torah views them as two separate lands. And therefore, even though they are all connected, it's considered different names, which is a cool thing in terms of verse 10. Okay, so that's verse 10. Verse 10 again says earth, which implies one earth, seas, multiple seas, because of different flavors. And now we come to verse 11 and 12. So if we get a volunteer to read verse 11 and 12, preferably someone who hasn't yet read. If you want one, there's extra page.
God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, herbage. Am I in the right day?
You're doing awesome.
I'm on day 3, okay. God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, herbage yielding seed, fruit trees yielding fruit, each after its kind, containing its own seed on the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, herbage yielding seed after its kind, and trees yielding fruit, each containing its seed after its kind. And God said that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, a third day.
Okay, awesome. Great job. So basically in verse 11, God says, let these things come out. And then in verse 12, it says, and the earth brought forth these things. Everyone put on your Jewish Talmudic glasses for a second, and see, can you notice a difference between what God said should come out and what it states in verse 12 came out? Is there a difference?
I'm rooting for you, Adam.
I'm waiting for you, Kate. Wait, seed after its kind.
We'll walk into it. It's very, very similar. There's a one-word difference.
After its kind.
After its kind. I didn't notice that one, but maybe that's also well. Let's check it out. They both say after its kind, right? Is it different? Which one? Oh, that actually is a difference. That's a great point. That is a difference. Rashi discusses that one as well.
What is sprout? What's the difference?
The word luminaries, the word after its kind,
Oh.
it says it an extra time in the second one, and it didn't say in the first one. Say again?
Let the earth sprout vegetation versus brought forth vegetation.
Okay.
So it's a tense difference there. But I think that would make sense.
So that makes sense. It's right, because God's telling them to do it, and then they actually did it. So
Right.
one's describing the process. Perfect. But it is an excellent.
Is it its own seed?
It's trees yielding fruit versus fruit trees yielding.
Okay, that's a good one. Get back to that 1 second. Just want to hear what Jory said.
Was it containing its own seed and then seed after its
You
kind?
already know all this.
Containing its own seed on earth. Fruit trees yielding fruit each after its kind, containing its own seed on earth. And the next one was each containing its seed after its kind. Yes, after its kind. That's what Abigail mentioned that also, that he does the after its kind. So there's two distinctions in this verse, right? One is what Marx has pointed out. In verse 11, it says, God told there to be fruit trees yielding fruit. While in verse 12 it says, and trees yielding fruit. Right? There's a distinction between fruit trees yielding fruit and trees yielding fruit. And the second distinction is that it says after its kind, which it only said when the earth actually did it, and didn't say it in the initial command from God. Two excellent points. Let's talk about the first one first, and we'll talk about the second one second. So, there was a concept, we've discussed this, and the Rashi explains as follows. God told them to create fruit trees bearing fruit. What does it mean, a fruit tree bearing fruit? A fruit tree, take the words literally, and it's clearer in the Hebrew because we use the word fruit tree in English to just mean any tree that has fruit on it. We call an apple tree a fruit tree, we call an orange tree a fruit tree. But if you look at the Hebrew, which is eitz pri, it literally means a tree that is a fruit bearing fruit. Not a fruit tree like we refer to in English for a tree that has fruit on it, but a fruit tree is a tree that is a fruit, like a fruit tree. The tree is a fruit bearing fruit, and the earth produced a tree, meaning not a fruit tree, not a tree that is a fruit, just a tree bearing fruit. Right? So again, God commands them, you should be yourself the fruit. You, fruit tree, should be the fruit. The fruit tree should bear the fruit. And the earth didn't do that. The earth seemed to veer from what God told it to do. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And just produced a tree, and that tree created fruit. So the question is, what does this mean? What does it mean that the earth veered or changed from what God had told it to do? God said, be a fruit tree. So what does it mean? The earth
has free will.
The earth has free will. Okay, so what does that mean? A tiny bit of free will. Okay, in what sense? I've heard people say that before, and I've studied school, and they said the earth has free will, and I don't know. To me, it's hard for me to understand that. But I've seen that before. I don't know. What does it mean that the earth has free will? What does it choose? Like, does it still choose nowadays? Like, we still choose nowadays. We're alive, we choose. I don't know. People say that. I don't really ever understand exactly how the earth, at some minute level, had free will, and maybe in the beginning. Okay, that definitely is an answer. I want to explain it, I guess, the way that to me makes more sense. But again, there's multiple ways to interpret it. As long as you're within the guidelines of the Torah, that's a fair explanation. So I have a hard time saying that the trees have free will because, I don't know, the way I understand it is that's the uniqueness of man. We'll get here more of the creation of man in the next class. But the uniqueness of man is that we have free will. We can be good, we can be bad. That's our greatness. It also is our downfall if we're bad, but it allows us to be great when we choose to be good. If the earth is choosing it, so then is man really unique? Everyone has that. So let's say, okay, in a minute amount, it's possible in the beginning, definitely has a valid approach like that. So when I understand this, gets back to that concept. We mentioned this in, was it the last class? Yeah, in the beginning of the last class we mentioned this. And that is that Kabbalah compares this world to a fruit. Remember the beginning of last class, we spoke about the parable that Maimonides gave for guys that were perplexed by the difficulty in approaching Genesis, because we're looking at the world trying to understand what was behind it. And like we gave an example, if you look at a person, try to figure out where did a person come from, and if you've never met a woman before, and you're just looking at a guy, where did he come from, you'll never figure out where he came from, because you don't have access to that information. The creation itself naturally hides its source. That's what we spoke about last time. And we spoke about how the same is true, that if you have fruit on a tree, fruits naturally hide their source. If you just see these apples here, and you can't see the tree that it came from, and you've never seen a tree in your life, you lived in a cement world. You have fruit stores, and you go to the fruit store and you have these delicious apples. And one day you wonder, where did the apples come from? But you have no clue how. You can study the apples, you can look at their makeup, you can look at their DNA, you can look at everything, you'll never figure out what a tree is. You'll never imagine a tall, brown, hard thing, unedible generally, and you won't see that from it. Why? Because we mentioned last time that part of the creation of this world is that the fruit hides its source. That's true across the world. And Kabbalah says that this world is called Ha'olam, right? Olam. Tikkun Olam, Kol Ha'olam Kulo. Olam is the Hebrew word for world. The word Ha'olam can also be read Ha'elem, which is hiddenness. God created our world in a way that he hid himself from being openly seen in our world. God hides himself. And because of that, Kabbalah calls our world the world of fruit. Why? Because when you look at a fruit, it hides its source. And that's the nature of fruit. So, I've heard a beautiful explanation that why is it that the trees were supposed to themselves taste good, but rather they veered from this and they became hard barks that were unedible, that just produced fruit. Because if the bark itself would taste like the fruit, that's like the antithesis of what this world is. The definition of this world is that you can't see the source of the fruit in the fruit itself. That is the essence of this world. The essence of this world is that the fruit hides its source. So it was a natural outgrowth. God intended, in a certain sense, that the tree itself should be the fruit. But it wasn't that the tree chose to not be the fruit. As this expression came out into our world, which you mentioned, after day 2, it's a world that's hiding God in it. It's a world that exists with division in it. A world that exists in multiplicity. So the natural outgrowth of that was that the trees actually produced a fruit that hides where it comes from. And it wasn't necessarily a dispute with God what should happen. It was the expression of that statement of God. As it takes expression in our world, it can't come out that the bark itself, the fruit of the tree itself is the fruit. Because that itself would undermine the world. Our world expresses itself as the world of fruit, where the fruit hides the source behind it. So that's an explanation I heard, why it's explaining the distinction between verse 11 and verse 12, of why it says, God said that it be fruit tree, meaning a tree that is the fruit, but rather what came out was trees bearing fruit. And interestingly, the Talmud does say that in the world to come, when the world comes to the next world, in times of Mashiach, when the world comes to its perfection, the trees themselves will again taste like fruit. What does that mean? It means that there will be that clarity of when you look at our world, you'll be able to see the source. And that's the biggest struggle of all of us in this world, and each of us are on our own level in this, is that we don't really feel God. We don't really see God. God hides himself. So the question is, that's our struggle. Everyone has it on their level. Is how much is he really here? How much is he really watching? How much is he really there? And that's the essence of this world. That's the struggle of man in this world, trying to figure that out. And that is really represented in this concept of the trees not bringing out properly this message. Rather, they naturally produce a system of the apples not showing the tree itself. So that's what I believe that is. Regarding just mention this, I wasn't planning on discussing it, but the other point you made, that it says in verse 11, it says, let the earth sprout vegetation, fruit trees yielding fruit after its kind. And then in verse 12, it says, each containing seeds after its kind. So Rashi explains that the fruit themselves, again, this is the fruits themselves learned from the fact that God told. The previous one, God didn't have to mention it much. When God told the trees to do this, the other parts that came out of that all understood that it wasn't specific just to the tree. It was an extension to the vegetation that came afterwards. So that's why it doesn't mention it. It mentions it even though it wasn't ever told to do that. It still mentions that it did it on its own, so to speak, because once God had mentioned in the beginning, it was understood afterwards that the other ones came out in the same way of each plant producing seed that will produce its own plant afterwards.
Is that the only instance where that happens in creation, where God says one thing and then it makes its own?
It changes itself. So we'll find right now is another one. There's a few different examples of it, but that's the most, I guess, very blatant one. We'll see another one right now as we go to day 4. So day 4, verse 14 through 16. We have a new reader. Anyone want to take it?
I'll read it. I just need to Okay. God said, let there be luminaries in the firmament of the heaven to separate between the day and the night, and they shall serve as signs, and for festivals, and for days and years. And they shall serve as luminaries in the firmament of the heaven to shine upon the earth, and it was so. And God made the 2 great luminaries, the greater luminary to dominate the day, and the lesser luminary to dominate the night and the stars. Do we keep going?
Yeah, just finish it.
Okay.
Why not?
And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, to dominate by day and by night, and to separate between the light and darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the 4th day.
Okay, awesome. Great job. So, any questions on these verses? Anything interesting that you notice? And these are subtleties, which the Torah, again, is very pro asking questions, figuring things out. Don't be embarrassed to ask anything that looks off. That's what we do. We ask questions and we analyze until we figure out the truth. So, I didn't notice anything. If not, I could ask questions that I would ask. But
Well, in the beginning it said, and it was so. So there was another one that wasn't, it was good, but then later on it said that it was good.
so you're asking what was this? What was it? Was so?
Correct.
Okay. Good question.
What's your quick story on why the greater luminary is the sun and the lesser luminary is the moon?
Okay. Why is it like that? Why is it referring to? Is that what that's you asking in terms of the way it refers to it?
Do you have
or-
a little story about that?
Do I have a story with it? Okay.
I've heard a story about it.
Well,
Good
and also,
question.
like the light versus darkness. So light and dark were already created.
Mm-hmm.
So then what, like we were talking about before, what would the sun and the moon could be light, so what was light before then?
Perfect. Great question. What was light in day one when we already had light and darkness? I'll add in 2 more questions. Hope we'll cover them all. In the beginning, it says in verse 14, God created the luminaries. And it says through verse 6, and it says He's going to create these luminaries for the day and the night, referring to the sun and the moon, clear in the Hebrew. And then it says God made the 2 great luminaries, the great one to dominate the day, the lesser to dominate the night. Then all of a sudden, at the end of verse 16, it ends and the stars. Where did that come from? We were never discussing stars anywhere. Stars like an afterthought. All of a sudden, it mentions and the stars. God never said He's going to create the luminaries and the stars. He's creating the luminaries. Oh, by the way, and the stars. It's like, where do these stars come from? Question 1. Question 2 is just in verse 16 itself. It says God made the 2 great luminaries. And then it says the great luminary, or the greater luminary to the day, and the lesser luminary to dominate the night. So the implication of the 2 great luminaries is that they're both great, like equally, they're both great. There's like 2 of like similar great luminaries. But then it says within the same verse that there was a greater luminary and a lesser luminary. So there weren't 2 great luminaries, there were the 1 great one and the 1 lesser one. What would you call the 2 great luminaries? Okay, 2 extra questions. Just quickly, let's answer the questions. The "it was so" question is an interesting point. I do think we find that concept in other places also. We had it with that we find in 3rd day. It says God saw the waters be the heaven gathered in one area, dry land appear, and it was so. Then after it says it was good. So it seems like there's a 2-step process. I think the other ones have that also. Do we have that? The "it was so" seems to be going on like actual, like coming out of the creation itself. That was like the actualization of it. And then the Vayar Tov is like kind of like God seeing what He created. Like, this is the creation. It was so. And then God looks and says, yeah, that's perfect. That was like it was good. It's like the stamp of approval, like exactly what I wanted. That was kind of like those 2 things. The light and the darkness is a great question. We touched on this a little bit when we spoke about the Big Bang in the first class, and that is that the concept of light and dark is not really unique to the sun and the moon, right? Lightness and darkness, there's plenty of stars and there's light, and the concept of a sun is really a specific star that functions in terms of the Earth. That was something that was specifically created on day 4, but the inherent concept of light and dark was already created on day 1 in terms of, I don't know, other galaxies or other stars or other things that maybe provided light in the first place. But the creation of the sun is specifically here. So the question here is, what's the story what's with these 2 other questions? So it says God created 2 great luminaries, sun and the moon. And it says the greater luminary, the lesser luminary. So again, the Midrash brings a story to answer Abigail's question. It brings a story. And it says as follows. God created the sun and the moon. And the moon says, hey, wait a second. I got gypped. The sun is this like awesome star that's shining on the Earth and does a lot of stuff with Earth that allows photosynthesis and a lot of other life to take place because the sun exists, and it's a powerful being. That's why historically the sun god was always a powerful god, and not in Judaism obviously, but historically the sun has always been as being a powerful being because it did do a lot for the Earth. The moon is merely a reflection of the sun. So the moon says, like, now you should know there's a lot of things that depend on the moon as well. There's the tides are the most famously connected to the moon. There's other things as well. The moon does have an effect on the Earth, but its power is really a reflection of the sun. So the moon goes to God, and the moon says, like, I want to be like, like the son is like the man. Like I'm not the man. So let's how can we both function in this way? How can both of us, he's the king of the day, I'm the king of the night, but all I am is a reflection of him. So the Medrash explains as follows. And the Medrash explains that God said, if you don't want to be, you can't have two kings, right? You can't have the king of the day and the king of the night, so you can minimize yourself, you can become smaller. Which is, according to my understanding, when the phases of the moon really began. Waxing and waning, that was a concept that came out of, initially, let's just try to break this down and see exactly what this means. Initially, the sun was strong enough, powerful enough, and it still is, to properly give adequate light and do what it needs to do in the daytime. Anyone here ever seen a harvest moon? Know what that is? Can you tell us what it is? Harvest moon is like when the moon is low and it's like looks like really big and really bright, and you can like really like see outside at night with the moon. Like it actually like directly helps you see. Anyone that has lived in like more not such urban areas, more rural areas, and kind of went outside when there's no artificial light and you just see the sky and it's like incredible. You see so many stars, and if you get a full moon at that time, the moon actually gives a lot of light. So what does it mean there was two great luminaries? Now if they were both giving equal light, there were two suns, then it's very hard to understand what it means when it says one for the day and one for the night, because it would just always be day. Right? So it can't mean that there were two great luminaries that were equally illuminating during their times. So what does it mean there were two great luminaries? It means that there were two great luminaries that were each able to do their own job they needed to do 100%. Meaning the sun was able to shine during the day as it needed to, and the moon was able to shine at night as it needed to. Which would be a more full moon can shine at night what it needs to, and it's a great luminary in the sense that it accomplishes everything it needs to do. Because the moon complained, or didn't feel that it was fair, God minimized the moon. He shrunk the moon. And it says because of that, God added the stars to console the moon. What does this mean? So what that means is, again, obviously stars existed beforehand. We mentioned there was light before, like Denise answered before. It can't be that the creation of stars only were created then. It means, the way I understand it, is that within our Earth and our solar system that we're experiencing, God created this star called the sun at this time, and this star created and this moon at this time. And at the time that he created the moon to be waxing and waning, there was an additional creation of many stars to light up the night at that time. Now, what's going on here? The moon's talking, and first of all, I feel like I'm quoting these like Greek stories. Let me just, even if it doesn't bother you, it bothers me. So I'm gonna just speak this out, even if it doesn't bother you, because it bothered me for a long time until I looked into it and I wrapped my head around it. So we understand it is like this: when we see that something inanimate is talking, it could be the trees are talking, or or any of these things. There's really two basic ways of understanding this that I've come across, both of which seem valid to me, and if you have another way, let's discuss it. So one way is that every creation in this world is an expression of like a spiritual dimension, right? God's on top, and it's kind of like a crazy laboratory, and then like the light of God emanates from God, and it filters down until it creates our physical world. But everything is rooted back up. You have a soul, everything's rooted back up to God. And the famous quote, each blade of grass has a ministering angel that taps in and says it to grow. Have you ever heard that quote before? We've heard that before, so that's a medrash on Genesis. And it says that, and the concept is every physical thing has a certain like spiritual counterpart where it gets its like energy to exist from. So when we say that God's talking to the grass, it's not like the blade of grass starts talking or the moon starts talking, but it means that there is some spiritual background to this concept, and that is, so to speak, like the mirror image of the moon. The moon itself, in spiritual form, has a certain angel that gives it its energy to live, its energy to exist. And the one way that I think is the simple way to understand it is that the moon, the angel that's in charge of the moon, that spiritual concept in charge of the moon, is having this conversation with God. We only see the physical expression of that, but that kind of background spiritual angel is discussing this with God. That's one way to understand it. The way I prefer to understand it is perhaps more metaphorical, and meaning that there was never really a conversation. Hope I'm not heretical to say this, but I don't know that there was really ever a conversation. But what it means is that there's a certain essence, and this is just explaining it. If I want to bring out a concept that the essence of the moon didn't fit with the essence of the sun. So I could just say it like that, or I could bring that out in story form and express it in a way of like an argument between them. What it's really saying is that the creation of moon, in its essence, couldn't coexist with the creation of sun in its essence. So one of them had to change, and what changed was the moon, and the moon was minimized, which is really inherently unfair to the moon, because the moon didn't do anything wrong, it just had to change because their essence couldn't coexist, and because of that, stars were created to fix that problem. It's not necessarily a conversation, just the way to express that or to bring that out of this just like not fitting, like how could that be, is we bring it out in terms of like as if the moon is talking to God, and that's a way to like bring out the message. But what's really happening here is it's like a question of like essence. Like we find this, it's bothered me for like a long time also. Like there's a famous story that God asked all the nations, do you want the Torah? And they all said no, and he went to the Jewish nation and said, do you want the Torah, right? It's like, how did he ask all the nations? Like, what did he do? Did they all like have like conference, they all like a crazy dream one night? Like everyone in all the nations wakes up like hallucinogenic, like, whoa, is that a crazy dream from God? And like, I don't want the Torah. Like, is that what happened? Like, that's weird. Like, what happened? So the way I always understood it is that it was really just like that's the way of expressing the essence. The essence of Torah didn't fit with the essence of the other nations. They didn't fit together. It wasn't a good match. The essence of the Jewish nation was very compatible with the Torah. That fit. The way we express that is as if God asked the nations, do you want this? And they said no, not necessarily because that conversation took place, but more that's an expression of how these two concepts didn't fit. That breaking apart. So the question is, however you want to understand it, what exactly was the problem with the moon? Like what happened? So I think the message from this is that the moon wanted to be, in essence, like I'm in charge of the night, so I should be this great being that's in charge of the night. But God says to him, if you want to be close to me, you're coming to me, you want to be greater, that's not how you connect to God. God says, the way you connect to me is through humility. You want to make yourself smaller. You want to say, no, God, I don't think we can both be as great as we can. I'll make myself smaller. Maybe God would have made the sun smaller. No, you don't have to. You can be, so to speak. The message is that you're coming to God saying, I want my own inherent light. I want to be in charge of the night in a greater capacity. God says, no, that's not the way to connect to me. But at the same time, what did God do? God gave the moon stars, which do have their own inherent light. He agreed to the moon. He gave them, you want your own light? You want to be like the sun? You want to be that great? Sure, I'll give you these stars. They'll have their own inherent light. But at the same time, you need to learn a lesson that the main point is humility. And that is what, for sure, it's 5 getting put here. Okay, so that's the sun and the moon. And here are the stars. Okay. I'm off at my slides tonight. Apologize. Okay, moving on towards the end here. Let's try to do now day 5 quickly. Day 5 is a big day, and it really continues a little bit to the end of the page here. Let's see this. We have a volunteer reader from verse 20 through 25.
God said, let the waters teem with teeming living creatures, and fowl that fly about over the earth, across the expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea giants and every living being that creeps, with which the waters teemed with their kinds, and all winged fowl of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas. But the fowl shall increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning the 5th day.
Do a little more.
God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures, each according to its kind, animal and creeping thing, and beast of the land, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, and animal according to its kind, and every creeping being on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good.
Okay, fantastic. So, sorry, I jumped it down. The basic order that we have here is we have the creation of fish in the beginning, followed by birds, followed by land animals, and then followed by man over there, right? That's the basic concept here. And the question is, last time everyone was asking about it, it's a big question. People want to know, is this fit, or what's Torah's view on evolution, right? How do we look at that from the Jewish perspective? What's Torah's view on that? So, that's actually more portrayed here. In terms of purely the fossil record, again, we said the Torah doesn't really speak out every single thing that was creation, every single part of everything. There's no really blatant problems, as far as I know, between this basic expression of what happened and the general fossil records. The question really is, and this is really the underlying question when we discuss evolution, is what do we mean when we say evolution? What are we referring to? So in general, we can step back and we can say there's two parts. One part of evolution is that simple life gave forth to complex life, right? Started with amoebas and we ended up with people, right? Simple life developed to complex life. That's one part of evolution. The other part of evolution is I guess more with natural selection, which is that the greater line of species outlasted the lesser line of species, the weaker line of species, right? These are two basic concepts of evolution and natural selection. So the second concept is, I think, a very logical concept. I don't think anyone will disagree with that. You have two types of species. One of them has a mutation, let's say, and ends up being more adaptable to certain surroundings or to a certain setting or to warding off a certain enemy. It's very logical to assume that that version will outlast its qualified other half. That's very logical. We come to the first part of the question, so that's where the question starts. When we come to the question of did simple life bring forth complex life, or was there this creation? Now we did mention in the first class the concept of how Nachmanides explains of Tohu and Bohu, that there was an initial spark of creation. There was only one creation ex nihilo. There's only one creation of something from nothing, and that creation brought forth everything else from it. But that was really that doesn't say a process, right? That's just saying there was certain fundamental creation that was able to God was able to draw forth and bring out from that everything else. So the real underlying question is what caused, or how did it come out that simple life changed to complex life? So there's a lot of missing links even in the fossil record itself. We find a lot of where science is really coming from, and again, the theory of evolution is still a pretty good theory. There's a lot of approval of it in the scientific community. There's also a lot of disapproval of it in the scientific community. It's not a fact. It is a theory. One of the problems with the theory is that one, we've never seen evolution happen, and at some point we should have seen different stages of things happening. We only have distinct stages. We don't actually have anything in the process of it. That's a question. And the other question is that fossil record finds a lot of things that they have like a common gene between different families or different species, but we don't find the animals that are actually middle versions between those two species. We only find the two species. Science is missing a lot of the links between the species. So we find certain genes that exist in a monkey that will exist in a human also. We'll say, why does a human have this? Maybe we don't know why he needs it. And the monkey also has it. But then there's a certain leap of faith that says, because the monkey has it and the human has it, it must be that the human came from the monkey. Right? That we don't have so many fossil records throughout all of the development here that actually shows the linking of it. Now, if you want to say that it did happen, I'm not opposed to saying that happened. You could say that happened. The underlying question is, what triggers the change from complex from simple to complex? Is it a group of random mutations that somehow, from a bunch of electrons and neurons, eventually evolved mud and intelligence and consciousness, and all of these things are just evolved from nothing? Or do we say intelligence came from greater intelligence? I think that's really the underlying question when we ask, does Judaism agree with evolution? When we say evolution, the scientific community, what they really mean is that there was random mutations that came forth to bring forth human life. If you want to ask purely, can complex beings have come from simple beings? The answer is, God could have done that. The Torah doesn't say God didn't do that. Do I believe it? Am I sure it happened? No. But again, like we spoke about last time, by the age of the universe, some things the Torah doesn't say explicitly. So we have different answers, and we can discuss the different answers. But it's not a tenet of faith. At the end of the day, the question is, if you believe that God created the world, and God engineered this transformation from simple to complex, so if you want to say, I'm going to read you in a second an amazing piece from a Hirsch, but if you want to say that it came from one being evolving, there's nothing wrong with saying that. Does the Torah say that is what happened? No, the Torah says that is what happened. You can find certain Torah commentators, there are certain commentators that seem to imply by the creation of man, it says there's a scorner that says that God seemed to have taken a creature that already existed and imbued it with life, making it man. There are certain commentators that seem to say which would fit with evolution in terms of there being something like that. Many commentators disagree with that. Again, the Torah is not exactly clear on this. The real question is what triggered that process? The word evolution implies there's a randomness. if you change the word evolution and you don't say simple beings evolved into complex beings, we say simple beings developed into complex beings, and there was a developer behind it, so then there's nothing un-Jewish about saying that. The question is, are you claiming that smart life came from dumb life, that mud and nothing produced intelligence, or do you claim that there's a greater being that kind of masterfully brought this forth? And that's where I think the point of distinction. I think inherently the theory itself doesn't have any major issues. If you have a difference of opinion, you could tell me that you disagree with that. I just want to read to you an amazing few sentences here. This is by Stanton fellow Hirsch, who was early 1800s. It was right when I guess right after Darwin, and it wasn't accepted then that this theory of evolution. But he's discussing here. He has a very interesting speech he gave at graduation, I think, or something like that, of the distinction, I guess, I think, between Jewish and Christian's approach to science. And he says here, this will never change, not even if the latest scientific notion that the genesis of all the multitude of organic forms on Earth can be traced back to one single, most primeval form of life should ever appear to be anything more than what it is today, a vague hypothesis still unsupported by fact. Even if this notion were ever to gain complete acceptance by the scientific world, Jewish thought, unlike the reasoning of the high priest of that notion, would nonetheless never summon us to revere a still extant representative of the primal forms as a supposed ancestor of us all. Rather, Judaism in that case would call upon its adherents to give even greater reverence than ever before to the one sole God, who in his boundless creative wisdom and eternal omnipotence needed to bring into existence no more than one single amorphous nucleus and one single law of adaptation and heredity in order to bring forth from what seemed chaos but was in fact a very definite order, the infinite variety of species we know today. Each with its unique characteristics sets it apart from all the creatures. So Hirsch's writing basically is that he was again at this time when the concept of evolution was basically just suggested as a vague hypothesis, like he writes. And his concept is, does the Torah seem to say that? We don't have any really rich Jewish tradition that directly tells us this process of creation. Like we mentioned, not every single detail is listed. So can it fit with it? So again, the approach is, who designed it? Who caused it to happen? If you want to say that there was one single nucleus that produced that, so if you view God as being able to take that into, everything that exists nowadays, from rocks to fish to people to zebras to different types of people, so that's just, if anything, a greater amazement of what God's able to do and what God can do. And if that's the perspective and you're viewing that there is a creator, that's really the main point behind most of these points in terms of, does science fit with the Torah? The point of science is that in the scientific world, God is not scientific, because you can't test it. He doesn't exist in a laboratory. So that's really the point where it comes into contrast to science. The theory itself, is it opposed by the Torah? No. The question is it a random scientific theory that we don't, again, we're missing links in, and how did it come out? But, well, it must just be that this eventually came into that, we're just missing that link stuff because they have common things. Or it could be that God developed from this to that, and he kept some similarities, and that was the process of development. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So that's really, I think, that's why I understand the Jewish approach to evolution. Everyone who has questions on it, let's just try to finish this up so everyone who wants to go can go, just because it's getting late. One last point before we're done, and that is that we'll find in day 5 when God creates the animals. So we said he created the fish, the birds, and animals. We only find on day 5 that it says, let's see this. Verse 22, God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and full of waters and sea, but the fowl shall increase on the earth. Right? God here is talking with the creations of day 5, which is the creations of fish and birds. We don't find that God ever gave the blessing of be fruitful and multiply to land animals. Right? If you look at verse 6, it says, God let earth bring forth living creatures, each according to its kind, etc. It doesn't mention anything about giving them any blessing. So the question is, again, whenever we find something in one place and we don't find it in the other place, we're always bothered by why over there, not over there. So Rashi explains again that God did not want to bless the land animals, since included in the land animals was the serpent that was going to cause man to sin. God didn't want those creatures to get his blessing. So therefore, God intentionally left the blessing off of land animals, and he only gave it to the fish and the birds because they were harmless. So he gave them his blessing. That was just one last point. to finish up the what's it called? And that's the class today. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. And any questions?
Wait, people still multiply not for people either?
So we find it again by people.
Oh.
If you look on day 6, but it skips in the middle. It says by fish, and it says by fish and birds. It skips animals. God creates man. It says to man and Adam and Eve, you should be fruitful and multiply also. Interestingly, though, it's brought down in Talmud that it was a custom to get married on the day that fish was created because that brings with it a blessing of being fruitful and multiply. And in ancient times, they used to try to plan the wedding dates on that day. So, okay, any other questions?
Can you go back one slide?
One
This
second.
is